I was standing in my driveway, staring at a certified letter from the Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association, when I realized that sometimes the best revenge comes not from what you do, but from what you stop doing. My name is Garrison, and I have lived in Meadowbrook Heights, just outside Denver, Colorado, for the past 8 years. When I bought this property back in 2017, I thought I was getting a good deal on a nice house in a decent neighborhood. The house sat on a corner lot, nearly 2 acres, which was unusual for this development. Most of the other homes were crammed onto half-acre parcels, but mine had been one of the original farmhouses in the area before the developer bought up the surrounding land and built the subdivision around it. The letter in my hand was demanding $10,000 in fines. $10,000 for snow piles in my yard. I read it 3 times, thinking there had to be some mistake. We had just come through a brutal February with back-to-back blizzards that dumped nearly 4 feet of snow on the Denver metro area. Everyone had massive snow piles in their yards. Mine were perhaps a bit bigger because I had the largest driveway and the most property to clear, but this was Colorado. Snow happened. Snow piles happened. I pulled out my phone and called the HOA management office. A woman answered on the 3rd ring. Meadowbrook Heights HOA, this is Brenda speaking. Hi, Brenda. This is Garrison on Willow Creek Drive. I just got a letter about fines for snow piles. Oh yes, Mr. Garrison, let me pull up your file. I heard typing in the background. Yes, you have been assessed $10,000 in fines for violation of Section 8.4 of the Community Guidelines, which prohibits unsightly accumulations of snow and ice that detract from the aesthetic standards of the neighborhood. I almost laughed. Brenda, we just had 4 feet of snow. Where exactly am I supposed to put it? The guidelines require that all snow removal be conducted in a manner that maintains the visual harmony of the community. That is complete nonsense. Everyone has snow piles right now. Your property has been specifically cited due to the excessive nature of the accumulation and multiple complaints from neighbors. Multiple complaints? From who? I am not at liberty to disclose that information, but the citations were issued following an inspection by our Community Standards Director, Patricia Hendricks. Of course, Patricia. I should have known. Patricia Hendricks was the stereotype of every HOA horror story you have ever heard. She was a woman in her mid-50s with blonde hair that she kept in a severe bob, perfectly manicured nails, and a perpetual expression that suggested she was smelling something unpleasant. She drove a white Lexus SUV with a vanity plate that read Horeb, and she spent her days prowling the neighborhood looking for violations. I had run into her a few times over the years. She had cited me for leaving my trash cans visible from the street for more than 12 hours after pickup. She had complained about the color of my mailbox being half a shade off from the approved palette. She had even tried to fine me for parking my own truck in my own driveway because it was a work truck with my company logo on the side. I want to appeal this, I said. You have 30 days to file a formal appeal with the board. The next board meeting is scheduled for March 15th. You can find the appeal form on the community website. And if I do not pay, the fine will increase by $500 per week, and the HOA has the right to place a lien on your property. I hung up without saying goodbye. My hands were shaking with anger. $10,000 for snow in Colorado in February. I walked around my property, looking at the snow piles in question. Yes, they were large. I had piled snow along the back fence line and on the far side of my driveway, away from the street. The piles were maybe 6 or 7 feet high at their tallest points. But it was not like I was running a ski resort in my backyard. It was just snow from clearing my driveway and walkways. I spent the rest of that evening researching HOA law in Colorado. I learned that homeowners associations have broad authority to enforce community guidelines, but that authority is not unlimited. They have to follow their own rules. They have to apply those rules consistently, and the rules have to be reasonable. A $10,000 fine for snow piles did not seem reasonable to me. The next morning, I drove around the neighborhood before work. I took pictures of every single property that had snow piles visible from the street. I documented at least 30 homes with similar accumulations. Some were even larger than mine. None of them had received citations. I prepared my appeal carefully. I included the photos, I cited the relevant sections of Colorado HOA law, and I made a calm, rational argument that the fine was excessive, unreasonable, and selectively enforced. The board meeting on March 15th was held in the community clubhouse, a bland building near the neighborhood pool. I arrived 15 minutes early. The board consisted of 5 people, with Patricia serving as president. The other members were Roger Simmons, a retired accountant, Janet Morrison, a real estate agent, Tom Chen, an engineer, and Kevin Palmer, who worked in insurance. Patricia called the meeting to order at 7 o'clock sharp. She was wearing a cream-colored blazer over a silk blouse, and her lips were pressed into a thin line as she shuffled through papers. "We have several items on the agenda tonight," she announced. "But first, we will hear from Mr. Derek Garrison regarding his appeal of citation number 24-07. I stood up and walked to the front of the room. About a dozen other residents were scattered in the folding chairs, probably there for other agenda items. "Thank you for hearing my appeal," I began. "I am here to contest the $10,000 fine I received for snow accumulation on my property. First, I want to point out that the fine is grossly disproportionate to the alleged violation. Second, I have documented evidence that at least 30 other properties in this neighborhood had similar or greater snow accumulation, none of which were cited. This represents selective enforcement, which violates Colorado HOA law. Third, the community guidelines do not contain any specific prohibition against snow piles following natural weather events. The section cited in my violation notice is vague and subjective. I distributed copies of my documentation to the board members. Patricia barely glanced at hers. "Mr. Garrison," she said, "your property is highly visible due to its corner location. It sets the tone for the entire entrance to our community. The snow accumulation on your property was excessive and remained visible for an unreasonable period." "It had been less than a week since the last snowfall when I received the citation," I said. "And again, I have photographic evidence of similar conditions at dozens of other properties." "Those properties are not at the entrance to the community," Patricia said. "My property is 2 blocks from the entrance," I countered. "And even if visibility were a factor, that does not justify selective enforcement or an excessive fine." Roger, the accountant, cleared his throat. "Patricia, I have to say, $10,000 does seem steep for a temporary snow pile." "The guidelines clearly state," Patricia began. "The guidelines use subjective language," Tom Chen interrupted. "I have read them. Terms like unsightly and excessive are not defined, and Derek makes a good point about the selective enforcement." Patricia's face was turning red. "We received multiple complaints specifically about Mr. Garrison's property." "Can you provide documentation of those complaints?" I asked. "Complaints can be made anonymously to protect the privacy of community members." "So you are saying anyone can make an anonymous complaint and that is grounds for a $10,000 fine? Mr. Garrison, your tone is becoming hostile." My tone is becoming incredulous, I said, because this is clearly targeting. You have been looking for reasons to fine me since I moved in here. That is a serious accusation, Patricia said, her voice icy. It is an observation based on years of petty citations for things like mailbox colors and trash can timing. Janet, the real estate agent, spoke up. Can we perhaps reduce the fine to something more reasonable? Say $500. I shook my head. No, because I have not violated any reasonable standard. The fine should be dismissed entirely. Patricia looked at the other board members, all in favor of upholding the fine. She raised her hand. No one else did. All in favor of reducing the fine to $500. Janet, Roger, and Kevin raised their hands. The motion carries, Patricia said stiffly. The fine is reduced to $500, payable within 30 days. I am not paying that either, I said. I will see you in court if necessary. I walked out of the meeting, my heart pounding. I knew I was burning bridges, but I was tired of being pushed around by someone who clearly had it out for me. Over the next week, I consulted with a real estate attorney named Michael Torres. He reviewed my case and agreed that I had grounds to fight the fine. He also pointed out something I had not considered. These HOA disputes can get expensive, he said. Even if you win, you might spend more on legal fees than the fine itself. Are you sure you want to pursue this? It is the principle, I said. And honestly, I am starting to think about selling and getting out of this neighborhood anyway. That might be difficult with an HOA dispute on record, he said. It can affect your ability to sell. I left his office feeling frustrated and trapped. I went home and sat in my living room, staring out the window at my yard. The snow piles were already starting to melt. In another week or two, they would be gone entirely. The whole thing was absurd. That is when I noticed something I had never paid much attention to before. My property sat on a slight rise, and the natural slope of the land directed water runoff toward the back corner of my lot. There was a drainage culvert there, partially hidden by ornamental grasses that I had planted when I first moved in. I walked outside to take a closer look. The culvert was part of a larger drainage system, a concrete pipe about 2 feet in diameter that ran under my back fence. I had always assumed it was just a standard storm drain, but I had never really investigated where it went or what it did. I got a flashlight and knelt down to peer into the pipe. I could see that it ran downhill, away from my property, toward the newer section of the development. The next day, I went to the county planning office in Denver. I requested copies of the survey maps and drainage plans for my property and the surrounding area. The clerk helped me locate the files, and what I found was fascinating. My property, because it had been one of the original farmhouses in the area, sat at the highest point of the subdivision. When the developer had built out the rest of Meadowbrook Heights in the early 2000s, they had specifically incorporated my property into their drainage plan. The culvert on my land was the primary drainage route for approximately 40 homes in the newer section of the development. All of their storm runoff, all of their excess water, flowed through that pipe on my property. And here was the interesting part. According to the survey documents, the developer had recorded an easement on my property for the drainage system. The easement gave the HOA the right to maintain the drainage system, but it also imposed certain obligations on them. They were required to keep the system functional and to prevent any modifications that would impede drainage. But there was nothing in the easement that gave them any control over what I did with the rest of my property. The easement was specific to a 20-foot wide strip along my back fence line where the culvert ran. I made copies of everything and brought them home. Then, I started doing some research on water drainage and erosion control. I learned that snow piles, when they melt, can actually help to slow and filter water runoff, preventing erosion and reducing flooding. By placing my snow piles where I had, along the back fence line, I had actually been helping to protect the drainage system. Armed with this information, I went back to Michael Torres. "This changes things," he said, studying the survey maps. "The HOA is on shaky ground here. They are trying to fine you for actions on your own property that actually benefit the community drainage system. And they are ignoring the fact that they have an obligation to maintain that system. So what do I do? Let me send them a letter explaining the situation," he said. "Sometimes that is enough to make these problems go away." Michael drafted a formal letter to the HOA, laying out the facts about the drainage easement and explaining why the fine was not only unreasonable but also potentially detrimental to the community infrastructure. He sent it via certified mail. 2 weeks went by with no response. Then, on April 2nd, I received another letter from the HOA. This one informed me that because I had failed to pay the $500 fine, it had now increased to $1,000, and the HOA was moving forward with placing a lien on my property. I called Michael immediately. "They are not backing down," I told him. "Then we file suit," he said. "We can ask for a declaratory judgment that the fine is invalid and we can seek damages for harassment. How much will that cost? My retainer is $5,000. The total cost will depend on how long it drags out, but figure anywhere from $10,000 to $20,000 if it goes to trial." I felt sick. Even if I won, I would be out tens of thousands of dollars. And Patricia clearly was not going to let this go. That night, I could not sleep. I kept thinking about the drainage system, about how all of those homes depended on the water flowing through my property. An idea started to form in my mind. It was petty, maybe, but I was running out of options. The next morning, I called a landscaping company. "I need to put in a retaining wall," I told the contractor who came out to give me a quote. "Along my back fence line, about 100 feet long, maybe 4 feet high." He walked the property with me, taking measurements. "That is going to be expensive. You are looking at maybe $15,000 to $20,000 for a job this size, and you will need permits." "What about something temporary, like those big landscape boulders?" He thought about it. "Yeah, we could do that. Place them along the fence line, create a natural-looking barrier. Still would not be cheap, but cheaper than a full retaining wall. And I would not need permits for that, right? Not for decorative landscaping, no. How soon could you do it? I could have a crew out here next week." I hired him on the spot. The landscaping company delivered and placed 20 massive boulders along my back fence line on April 10th. Each boulder was about 3 feet in diameter and weighed several hundred pounds. They were arranged in a way that looked natural, like an ornamental rock garden. They also completely blocked the drainage culvert. I knew what I was doing. I knew that when the spring rains came and when the snow continued to melt, all of that water was going to back up. It would not go through the culvert anymore. It would have to find another way. And another way did not exist. 3 days later, we got a heavy rainstorm. 2 inches of rain fell overnight. By morning, my phone was ringing off the hook. I did not answer. By afternoon, there was a knock at my door. I looked through the peephole and saw Patricia Hendricks standing on my porch, her face flushed and her hair disheveled. I opened the door. "What did you do?" she demanded. "Good afternoon, Patricia. What can I help you with? You blocked the drainage system. There is water flooding into 8 different homes right now. You need to remove those boulders immediately." "Those are decorative landscaping features," I said calmly. "I am allowed to landscape my own property. You are deliberately causing property damage. I am doing nothing of the sort. I placed decorative rocks on my own land. If there is a drainage problem, perhaps the HOA should look into maintaining the infrastructure better. You know exactly what you are doing. This is criminal. I am calling the police. Please do, I said. I would love to explain to them how the HOA has been harassing me for months, issuing unreasonable fines, and threatening to put a lien on my property. Patricia pulled out her phone and dialed. I waited while she spoke to the dispatcher, explaining that I had deliberately caused flooding in the neighborhood. She was told that an officer would come by to investigate. 20 minutes later, a Denver police officer arrived. His name was Officer Martinez, and he looked tired, like this was not how he wanted to spend his afternoon. Patricia immediately launched into her complaint. The officer listened patiently, then turned to me. "Sir, did you place these boulders on your property?" "Yes, I did. Last week." "They are decorative landscaping. Were you aware that they would block the drainage system?" I was not thinking about drainage when I made the decision to improve my landscaping. I was thinking about aesthetics, which is something the HOA claims to care deeply about. Officer Martinez walked around to the back of my property to look at the situation. The water was indeed backing up, pooling behind the boulders. I could see the beginning of overflow running down the sides of my property toward the street. When the officer came back, he shook his head. "This is a civil matter. You folks need to work it out. Madam, if there is flooding causing property damage, your HOA should contact an attorney." "But he is doing this deliberately," Patricia protested. "Even if he is, it is still a civil matter. He is allowed to landscape his property. If that landscaping affects an easement or shared infrastructure, that is something you need to resolve through the courts or through negotiation." Patricia looked like she wanted to argue further, but Officer Martinez was already walking back to his patrol car. She turned to me, her eyes blazing. "This is not over." "You are right," I said. "It is not. Not until you drop the fines and stop harassing me." She stormed off to her Lexus and drove away, tires squealing. Over the next 2 days, the situation got worse. More rain fell. The water backed up further, and I started getting angry calls and messages from neighbors. Some of them were polite, asking if I knew about the drainage problem. Others were hostile, accusing me of deliberately sabotaging the neighborhood. I did not respond to any of them. On April 14th, I received a letter from an attorney representing the HOA. The letter demanded that I remove the boulders within 24 hours or face legal action for damages and for violation of the drainage easement. I forwarded the letter to Michael Torres. "Now we have them," he said. "They are admitting that there is a drainage easement and that it is essential to the neighborhood. But here is the thing. The easement gives them the right to maintain the drainage system. It does not give them the right to control what you do outside of the easement boundaries. And those boulders are not actually within the easement. They are on your property, just adjacent to it. So, what happens now? They will probably seek an emergency injunction to force you to remove the boulders. We will argue that the boulders are legal landscaping and that the HOA has alternative options, such as rerouting the drainage or creating a new outlet. In the meantime, I suggest we make them an offer." "What kind of offer?" "You agree to remove the boulders, and they agree to drop all fines and pay your attorney fees." "What about an agreement that they will not harass me going forward?" "We can try to include that, but it is hard to enforce." Michael sent the offer to the HOA's attorney. The response came back the next day. They rejected it. They wanted the boulders removed immediately with no conditions. The following week, the HOA filed for an emergency injunction in Denver County District Court. The hearing was scheduled for April 21st. In the meantime, the flooding was becoming a serious problem. I heard from my neighbor, An elderly woman named Mrs. Chen, who had always been kind to me, that her basement had taken on water and her carpet was ruined. Another neighbor, a young couple with a baby, had water seeping into their crawlspace, creating a mold risk. I felt bad about the collateral damage, but I also knew that this was the only leverage I had. The HOA had pushed me into a corner, and now they were learning that corners can be dangerous places. The night before the court hearing, I got a visitor. It was Tom Chen, the engineer who served on the HOA board. He was also Mrs. Chen's son, which I had not realized before. "Derek, can we talk?" he asked. I invited him in. We sat in my living room and he looked uncomfortable. "Look, I know Patricia has been on your case," he said. "I voted against that fine. I think the whole thing is ridiculous. But now my mother's house is flooding and a lot of other people are suffering too. Is there any way we can work this out?" "I have already made an offer," I said. "Drop the fines, pay my attorney fees, and I remove the boulders." Patricia rejected it. "What if I can get the board to overrule her? Can you do that? We have the authority." "The board can vote to settle disputes without the president's approval if we have a majority." "Then do it. Get me the agreement in writing, signed by the board, and I will have the boulders removed the same day." Tom nodded. "I will try. I am meeting with Roger and Janet tomorrow morning before the hearing. I think I can convince them." He left, and I allowed myself a small measure of hope. The next morning, I arrived at the courthouse with Michael Torres. The hearing was in front of Judge Catherine Warren, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who had a reputation for cutting through nonsense. The HOA's attorney, a man named Philip Crane, presented their case first. He argued that I had deliberately and maliciously blocked a critical drainage system, causing thousands of dollars in property damage to multiple homeowners. He presented photos of flooded basements, damaged carpets, and standing water. He asked the judge to order me to remove the boulders immediately and to assess damages. Michael presented our defense. He explained the history of the harassment, the unreasonable fines, the selective enforcement. He showed the documentation of the drainage easement and pointed out that the boulders were not technically within the easement boundaries. He argued that the HOA had alternative options for dealing with drainage issues and that they were using the court to continue their pattern of harassment. Judge Warren listened to both sides, asking pointed questions. She seemed particularly interested in the timeline of events and the sequence of fines and appeals. "Let me see if I understand this correctly," she said. The HOA fined Mr. Garrison $10,000 for snow piles following a major winter storm. Mr. Garrison appealed, and the board reduced the fine to $500. Mr. Garrison declined to pay and consulted an attorney who sent a letter explaining the drainage easement. The HOA ignored that letter and increased the fine to $1,000. Then Mr. Garrison installed decorative landscaping that happens to interfere with drainage. "Is that accurate?" "That is essentially correct, Your Honor," Philip Crane said. "Although we dispute the characterization of the landscaping as decorative, it was clearly installed to cause harm." "Mr. Garrison, did you intend to block the drainage when you installed the boulders?" Judge Warren asked. I stood up. "Your Honor, I was frustrated and angry about what I felt was ongoing harassment. Did I know the boulders would affect drainage? Yes. Did I care at that moment? No, I felt like I was out of options." "At least he is honest," the judge said dryly. She looked at the attorneys. "Here is what I am going to do. Mr. Garrison, you will remove those boulders within 72 hours. However, the HOA will drop all fines related to the snow accumulation, and they will pay Mr. Garrison's reasonable attorney fees related to this dispute. Furthermore, The HOA is barred from assessing any fines against Mr. Garrison for a period of 1 year, unless there is a clear and documented violation of specific objective standards. Is that clear? Your Honor, we believe Mr. Garrison should pay for the property damage. Philip Crane began. Mr. Crane, your client created this situation by pursuing an unreasonable fine for a temporary condition following a natural weather event. Mr. Garrison responded poorly, but I am not inclined to reward the HOA's behavior. If individual homeowners have suffered damages, they can pursue Mr. Garrison in separate civil actions, but this court is not going to be used as a tool for HOA overreach. My order stands. She banged her gavel and the hearing was over. Outside the courthouse, Michael shook my hand. That went better than I expected. You got off light. What about the homeowners who might sue me for damages? Cross that bridge when you come to it. Most people will not want to spend the money on a lawsuit, especially when their HOA fees are supposed to cover this kind of thing. I went home and called the landscaping company. They came out the next day and removed the boulders. Within hours, the drainage was flowing normally again, and the flooding began to subside. Over the next week, I did receive a few demand letters from neighbors seeking compensation for water damage. Michael helped me respond to each one, pointing out that the HOA had a responsibility to maintain proper drainage infrastructure, and that any failures were ultimately their responsibility, not mine. Most of the homeowners backed off after that, but the story was far from over. In early May, I noticed that the spring runoff was particularly heavy that year. The snowpack in the mountains had been significant, and as temperatures warmed, massive amounts of water were flowing down through the metro area. My property, being at the high point of the subdivision, was handling it fine, but I started to wonder about the lower sections. One evening, I decided to take a walk through the neighborhood. I followed the drainage path from my property, tracking where the water went after it passed through the culvert. What I found was disturbing. The drainage system that the developer had installed was inadequate. The pipes were too small, and there were multiple places where the system was clogged with debris or damaged. The HOA had clearly not been maintaining it properly. Water was pooling in several low-lying areas, and a few homes on the far end of the development had standing water in their yards. I took photos and videos, documenting everything I saw. Then, I did some more research. It turned out that the HOA had a legal obligation to maintain common infrastructure, including drainage systems. If they had been neglecting that maintenance, they could be held liable for any resulting damages. And based on what I was seeing, they had been neglecting it for years. I sent an anonymous tip to the Denver Department of Public Health and Environment, suggesting that they might want to inspect the drainage systems in Meadowbrook Heights. I also sent copies of my photos to the county planning office. 2 weeks later, inspectors showed up in the neighborhood. They spent several days examining the drainage infrastructure, taking measurements and writing up reports. I watched from a distance, saying nothing. The results came back in early June. The county issued a formal notice to the HOA, stating that the drainage systems were not in compliance with county standards and that immediate repairs were required. The estimated cost was over $200,000. The HOA held an emergency meeting. I attended, along with about 50 other homeowners who were concerned about the special assessment that was likely coming. Patricia tried to maintain control of the meeting, but she was clearly rattled. She explained that the county had found deficiencies in the drainage system and that repairs would be necessary. "How much is this going to cost us?" someone asked. "The estimated cost is $210,000, Patricia said. That will be divided among all property owners in the community as a special assessment. There were gasps and angry mutters. With approximately 120 homes in the development, that worked out to about $1,700 per household. Why was this not maintained? Another homeowner demanded, "We pay HOA fees specifically for this kind of thing." Patricia looked uncomfortable. The previous board allocated funds for other priorities. What priorities? Landscaping at the entrance, resurfacing the pool, holiday decorations. The room erupted in anger. People were shouting, demanding explanations, calling for the board to resign. Tom Chen stood up. "I have been on this board for 2 years, and I have repeatedly raised concerns about infrastructure maintenance. Patricia has consistently voted to prioritize aesthetic improvements over essential repairs. I am calling for a vote of no confidence in her leadership." The motion was seconded immediately. Within minutes, a vote was held, and Patricia was removed as president of the HOA board. Roger Simmons was elected as interim president, and one of the first things he did was announce that the board would be hiring an independent auditor to review HOA finances. Patricia sat in her chair, her face pale, as the meeting continued around her. The audit results came back in July, and they were damning. For the past 5 years, Patricia had been allocating HOA funds based on her personal preferences rather than the community's actual needs. Essential maintenance had been deferred repeatedly. Even worse, the audit found evidence that Patricia had been awarding contracts to her brother-in-law's landscaping company at inflated prices, possibly in exchange for kickbacks. The HOA board voted to terminate Patricia's position as Community Standards Director. They also referred the findings to the Denver District Attorney's Office for potential criminal investigation. In August, Patricia was charged with theft and embezzlement. The prosecution alleged that she had misappropriated approximately $80,000 in HOA funds over a 5-year period. She was arrested and released on bond, and her trial was set for the following spring. Meanwhile, the HOA had to deal with the drainage repairs. The special assessment was issued, and most homeowners paid, though there was a lot of grumbling. A few homeowners tried to argue that they should not have to pay because they had not been responsible for the mismanagement. But ultimately, the courts ruled that all homeowners were jointly responsible for common infrastructure. I paid my share without complaint. After everything that had happened, $1,700 seemed like a small price for peace. The repairs took most of the fall. Crews dug up sections of the old drainage pipes and replaced them with larger, modern systems. They cleared out years of accumulated debris and installed proper filtering and maintenance access points. By November, the work was complete, and the neighborhood finally had a functional drainage system. Patricia's trial took place in March of the following year. I was called as a witness, and I testified about the pattern of harassment and unreasonable fines. Other homeowners testified about the misallocation of funds and the deferred maintenance. Patricia's brother-in-law was also charged as a co-conspirator, and he testified against her in exchange for a reduced sentence. The jury found Patricia guilty on 5 counts of theft and 2 counts of embezzlement. She was sentenced to 3 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA. I was not happy about her going to prison, exactly, but I felt a sense of justice. She had used her position to bully people and to enrich herself, and now she was facing consequences. After Patricia's conviction, life in Meadowbrook Heights gradually returned to normal. Roger served as HOA president for another year before stepping down. The new board was more focused on practical issues and less concerned with petty aesthetic violations. The community guidelines were revised to be more specific and less subjective. I never received another citation. In fact, the new board reached out to me with an apology. They acknowledged that I had been treated unfairly and that my complaints about the drainage system had ultimately led to necessary improvements. They even offered to reimburse my attorney fees beyond what the court had ordered, though I declined. I had already gotten what I wanted. Mrs. Chen, Tom's mother, baked me a pie as a thank you for pushing the drainage issue. We became friendly, and I started helping her with yard work and snow removal in the winters. The young couple whose crawlspace had flooded during my boulder incident moved away, which I felt bad about. But most of the other homeowners seemed to understand that I had been pushed to an extreme by Patricia's harassment. As for me, I decided not to sell my house after all. Despite everything, I liked the property and the location. And with Patricia gone and a more reasonable board in place, living in an HOA neighborhood became tolerable. I did make one change, though. I installed a small plaque near the drainage culvert on my property. It read, Meadowbrook Heights Primary Drainage Access, Essential Infrastructure. Please do not obstruct. It was a reminder, both to myself and to anyone else who saw it, that even small pieces of property can play important roles in a community. And that sometimes, the best way to fight back against unreasonable authority is to understand your own power. Every spring, when the snow melts and the runoff flows through that culvert on my land, I think about how close I came to causing serious damage just to make a point. I think about the flooded basements and the stress I caused to innocent neighbors. And I remind myself that there are better ways to solve problems. But I also think about Patricia and about people like her who use small amounts of power to make other people's lives miserable. And I do not regret standing up to her, even if my methods were questionable. The truth is, we all depend on each other in ways we do not always recognize. Those 40 homes depended on the drainage system that ran through my property. I depended on a reasonable HOA to maintain community standards without harassment. Patricia depended on people being too intimidated or too tired to fight back. When those dependencies are healthy and balanced, communities thrive. When they become exploitative or one-sided, everything falls apart. 3 years after the whole ordeal began, I was sitting on my back patio on a warm June evening, watching the sun set over the Rockies. My yard was green and well-maintained. The drainage culvert was flowing smoothly, doing its job without any drama. The neighborhood was quiet and peaceful. My phone rang. It was Michael Torres, my attorney. Hey Derek, I wanted to give you a heads up. Patricia Hendricks is being released from prison next month. She served her full sentence. Okay, I said. Thanks for letting me know. Just thought you should be aware in case she causes any trouble. I do not think she will. She does not live in the neighborhood anymore, right? No, she had to sell her house to pay restitution. I heard she is moving to Colorado Springs. Then I think we are fine. After I hung up, I thought about Patricia for a while. I wondered what she had learned from her experience. I hoped she had gained some perspective, some understanding that other people's rights and dignity matter. But I was not sure people like her really changed. What I knew for certain was that I had changed. I had learned that standing up for yourself is important, but so is understanding the ripple effects of your actions. I had learned that HOAs, for all their flaws, serve a purpose in maintaining communities, but that they need oversight and accountability just like any other organization. Most importantly, I had learned that sometimes the things we take for granted, like water flowing downhill, are actually complex systems that depend on cooperation and maintenance. And that goes for human systems just as much as drainage systems. The snow fine that started everything had been $10,000. By the time everything was resolved, between attorney fees, the special assessment, and the stress and time involved, the whole situation probably cost me $20,000 or more. It cost the HOA far more, and it cost Patricia her freedom, all because someone decided to enforce a rule that should never have existed in the first place. I finished my beer and went inside. Tomorrow, I would mow the lawn and trim the hedges. I would wave to my neighbors and make small talk about the weather. I would pay my HOA dues on time and follow the reasonable rules that kept the community functioning. But I would never forget what I learned about power, about infrastructure, and about the importance of knowing when to fight and when to compromise. And if anyone ever tried to fine me $10,000 for snow piles again, well, I knew where the drainage system was.